Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the East-West Schism in our continuing study of the history of Christianity. In our timeline of church history, we've already noted the ancient church, the medieval church, and the Reformed church, and then we've subdivided the medieval church into the early Middle Ages, the high Middle Ages, into which we're about to enter right now, and then we'll see the late Middle Ages. In those early Middle Ages, we'd had, and even before, really, if we want to count the Council of Nicaea and Council of Constantinople and some of those earlier ones, we'd had 7 ecumenical councils. The first 2 of those, in a sense, the first 4, but really the first 2 were focused on explaining the Trinity. And then beginning with the Council of Ephesus and Chalcedon and the next 2 at Constantinople, they were focusing more specifically on explaining the person of Jesus, who he is, fine-tuning that, and then we come to the last of the ecumenical councils, the Second Council of Nicaea, and that dealt with the subject of icons. Is it wrong for the church to use some sort of imagery of either Jesus, not of God? Everybody agreed you can't do that because God's invisible, but of Jesus or of various saints, how far can you go? Can you venerate those? Where does that turn into worship, which would be idolatry? And so the church had wrestled with those questions. And even though that approach looked a bit different from the Church of Rome to the church in the East, they had both agreed at the Second Council of Nicaea that icons were permissible. So what brought about the schism? Why did they split? Now, again, background information. At the Council of Constantinople, it had been agreed that the Bishop of Constantinople shall have the primacy after the Bishop of Rome, because his city is the New Rome. And so you had those patriarchal cities like Jerusalem, like Alexandria, like Antioch, some other important cities like Carthage and Hippo, Milan. But at the top of the list were Rome and then Constantinople. And of course, these 2 had been the 2 capitals of the Roman Empire, the one in the west, one in the east. But the split now takes place. Split takes place now in 1054, and this brings up the question: what were the issues? Why did the church split? A split that continues even to this day. Let's look at the issues. One issue, in the West, you have the church that sees itself as over the state. Now, not every emperor or king is going to agree to that, but the stance of the church is that the church is over the state. In the Eastern church, the state is over the church. That is, the emperor is the emperor, and you might have the church give him some advice, but he is over the church. In the Western church, the Pope is the final authority. In the Eastern church, it is the church councils which are the final authority. In the Western church, church councils have a certain level of authority, but only if they are approved by the Pope. In fact, a church council in the West cannot even exist unless the Pope calls the council. That's not the case in the East. In the West, now here's just a tendency. Theology tends to be for theologians. In the East, theology is for everyone. It was said that you could go into the marketplace during the Council of Nicaea and you could ask the fishmonger, "What's the price of fish today?" And he might say, "Jesus is begotten, not made." And well, that's not what I was asking. But the theology of the day was on everybody's lips. Everyone was concerned about it. In the West, that was for the clergy to worry about. That was for the priests to talk about, not so much for the common people. In the West, celibacy was demanded for nearly all positions. In the East, marriage was permitted except for the bishop. In the West, they adopted, and this is probably the key issue, they adopted what was called the filioque clause. Now we have to explain that. When we look at both East and West, they both agree that the Trinity, one God, who exists in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And yet there's a passage over in John chapter 15, verse 26, that says, when the Helper comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, this is Jesus speaking. And notice that Helper is, that is, he's further described as the Spirit of truth who proceeds from the Father. Now notice, the Spirit, that passage says, proceeds from the Father. And so in the Nicene Creed, they would speak about how the Spirit proceeds from the Father. And yet, a bit later, after the Council of Nicaea, quite a bit after, the Roman Church had inserted that the language that said the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And in the East, they said, wait a minute, they objected to that. You can't add that. That's not in the passage. And they said, well, it's not specifically in that passage, but it is. It is derived from when we understand who Jesus is. The deity of Jesus pushes that. And Eastern Church was saying, well, we believe in the deity of Jesus, but we don't agree with that clause. And so this was a dividing issue, and still is to this day. Now, initially, when when that split took place, and what took place on in July 1054, the a representative from the Pope walked into the Hagia Sophia, where they were preparing the Mass, and threw down a papal bull of excommunication and said, "That's it. You guys are all out of the church. You guys are all going to hell. You're excommunicated." Um, and eventually the patriarch from Constantinople returned the favor. And that was the state of things for the next, not quite 1,000 years, but a good 900 years. It's only been in the last 20 or 25 years that that breach has begun to be healed. We still have two separate churches, but for example, here's a picture of Pope Francis with the Patriarch Bartholomew, the patriarch from the Eastern Orthodox Church, actually meeting together, and they've had several different meetings like this since the mid 1990s. And they're no longer saying that the other group is going to hell, but rather they've softened that, and yet there still are some viable issues of disagreement between the two churches.